normal. You know,
Yeah.
for example, when I was a small child, there was a creek behind the houses across the street. And in the summertime, as evening was coming, there would be tens of thousands of lightning bugs, fireflies. There'd be clouds, literally clouds of them. And the whole neighborhood would be out there at night, and the kids would have their jars to put them in with holes in the jars for the bugs to breathe through, you know. And I think it must have been like 30 or 40 years later before it occurred to me that that was a very unusual, distinct phenomenon that I never saw again in my life. You know, but at the time you just figured that was in every neighborhood.
That's the way it is everywhere. Yeah.
So the behavior you see around you become normal and so forth. You know, nothing to compare it to. It becomes kind of the matrix for you. So I guess I have the floor here, huh?
Yeah, back to you.
Okay. Well, I only prepared a couple of songs, but I'll give them my.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Alka told me that one issue of interest is what some people call spiritual teammates. You know, a lot of us feel or get involved in some sort of indoctrinated spiritual path where the idea is that there's a great many beings of some order that are in or around your body and kind of stuck there. And I was thinking about that this morning because it's never been an issue for me. You know, occasionally I will have a client who has some specific, you know, one or two beings that they feel they're having trouble with that are in or around them. And to me, that's like any other relationship. You handle it the same way as any other relationship. Well, what happens? You know, what have you done to them? What have they done to you? What is it you couldn't experience that they did, or what was it that they couldn't experience that you did? Like what I call a harmony restoration process is one of my techniques, whereby very often when I run it on my client, and very often the next day they're telling me somehow the other person changed and they like them a lot more, and so forth. But when I first came across this information, this idea that there's like a swarm of spirits in or around you, and they're dangerous to you, and they're affecting your thoughts and your feelings and all of that. It's just my own perspective, but I wasn't sensing any of that, but I just thought, well, you know what, if anybody's here, you don't have to go anywhere. You're welcome to be right where you are with me. I love you, and be comfortable. If you want to be here, feel at home, and as I progressed through the various spiritual practices that I was doing, for me, that never came up as an issue. Now, does that mean they don't exist? Does that mean that they had no quarrel with me? Does that mean that they felt comfortable leaving? I don't know. It doesn't matter. But I think that's how a person should approach life in general. If somebody's all inappropriate behavior comes from some kind of fear, and the most basic fear, the most primal fear, and fear is the most primal negative emotion, whether it's panic or terror or anxiety, it's still a form of variation of fear. The most primal fear is being unloved and not being accepted. I've always felt that if people could open up and express whatever they're feeling to everybody and everybody accepted it, there would be no need for any form of therapy.
Yeah, fear is definitely a big deal.
Yeah, every misbehavior and every program that a person installs is out of fear too. It's out of the idea that there's something that's too painful or will harm them or overwhelm them, so they want to try and push it away and keep it at arm's length, which in reality keeps it there rather than just let it express, digest, and be done, which is always easier than people think it's going to be. I find that one of the biggest difficulties people have in digesting or processing anything is that they're still busy projecting it to be too much. This is going to take a long time. This is really difficult. I'll just say, it's simply energy. How about trying not to project it as being anything in particular? Just take what you actually get. And then it's usually taken care of in a few minutes. We have a tendency to do that. We don't realize that resistance is the whole problem. And when you create or project something as being formidable or unconquerable, painful, whatever, that projecting is a form of resistance. It makes it more difficult for you to simply let whatever it is be here and just be absorbed.
Yeah, I would, to me, it's an energy thing, and you're putting more energy into it. I mean, it's like an overt and a withhold, I mean, just saying, yeah, I did this, sorry. It's like, okay, so then that energy, can kind of dissipate if the other person or the offended party says, well, yeah, just don't do it anymore, okay? And then instead, oh, I don't want anybody to know about this. So then you got to put that much energy there to shield it from everybody else, and it just
Well, again, it's that fear of being vulnerable and exposed.
yeah,
People, they won't be accepted and you won't be loved if people knew that you did such a thing. And what I tell people is they got the same stuff as you. We all do, Why don't we all agree it's okay and get it over with,
well, I can relate to that because there was a situation, and I don't remember the exact details, but I said something to the effect that I was really homicidally pissed off, about something. And I felt kind of bad, like I didn't really want to share that, but then I did. And somebody said, yeah, I can relate to that. Well, at least I'm not the only one like that. And
yeah, get in line. Welcome to the club. Yeah, we have those moments. We have the full spectrum of energy within us. All of us do. The thing is, you just if you just look at it as it was originally created as spiritual beings, the creation of such energies, it was just for fun and amusement. Just let it be fun and amusing, and you don't have to maintain it as an attitude that defines who you are. Which, by the way, when we talk about overts and withholds, it's something I do want to comment on. Overts being harmful acts, withholds being keeping something in and not telling anybody about it. For anybody who doesn't understand that, these are Scientology terms.
right.
And when a person expresses and owns what they consider to be their harmful acts, they're kind of liberated from the effects holding that in has had on them. But what is not understood in Scientology is that if you want to correct and transcend and be done with the behaviors of committing harmful acts, well then processing what you've done is useful. It's a Band-Aid, but it doesn't change behavior patterns. It may just forestall them for a little while, generally speaking. If you want to correct tendencies towards some sort of bad behavior, you find what identity the person is acting out through to do that. Because it's not natural in a spiritual being to harm. It is very unnatural. And one of the prime reasons why we don't allow ourselves to have fantastic spiritual abilities is one way or another we've done harm, and we don't want to be capable of doing more harm or greater harm. And one of the techniques I use when a person has what you could call an ascension, profound change of perspective and existence and ability and so forth. A procedure done to stabilize that state so it will remain is to have the person take a look at if they've ever used such abilities as they just regained in any harmful way, so that they can process it. And then they won't have the fear of exercising those abilities that they might commit those harmful acts again. So it's very important to do that. But when you actually process whatever particular persona a person has been behaving badly through, the point where they can let that go, then all the behaviors that spring from that substitute presence are gone. And there's not going to be, like happens in Scientology so much, people, saw this so much in those days, you know, people would come in with the same type of list of overts and withholds as they had not long ago. You know, I remember in particular this one woman who was a very high up senior Sea Org commander person with great responsibilities. And I was in a room in the building, and she just happened to have left her list of her harmful acts, or overts and withholds. It's sitting there on the desk, and like her husband was like one of the highest commanders in the structure of Scientology at that time. And she said, one of her like overts and withholds were that, well, I said that he did this and he did that horrible thing and he did that. I just made it all up. You know, that was like, you know, it was just, and then she put an exclamation point next to it. I just made all that stuff up about him, you know? And, you know, being in her position, she was routinely put through all kinds of security checks and what have you done now? And even at that level, for all that responsibility and all the routine, you know, putting her on the Scientology e-meter and having her give up her overs and withholds, you know, in between those times, you know, these things were still going on. And then you're just like, it's like taking a shower at the end of the day, you know, you go out and get dirty every day, and then you have your shower, and then you go out and get dirty again. It's like the behaviors don't change. Your behaviors don't change until you divest yourself of the personality that, for whatever reason, you resorted to taking on.
Yeah, Dexter, I don't mean to be monopolizing the conversation here, but and anybody else, of course, is free to hop in. But you know what you described there, we had a procedure, and you may be familiar to some degree with Alan Walter, and
very much brilliant guy. Brilliant guy.
Yeah. Well, we had a procedure at the ranch, which like I said, you know, the Advanced Communication Leadership Center, but it was the P3, the Presence 3, and it was for problem, difficult identities. Okay, things that.
I'm completely familiar with Presence 3. In fact, I rewrote it several times myself, and connected dots he didn't connect, and changed. But Presence.
That's and you know, I was adopted, and when my birth mother, apparently, you know, as far as I can tell, you know, it was the last time that I saw her, and you know, it was pretty emotional thing, you know, and what I came to realize was a lot of it was the transference of her emotions to me, because I guess, you know, I had some awareness and all that, but you know, at a few weeks old, I wasn't totally cognizant of all the ins and outs of life or whatever. But it's just well, there was another thing, and this was just in a discussion and that I had with the guy on Presence. And, you know, his assertion was, well, you're either present or you're not. And, you know, he's, you know, a brilliant musician. Okay. So I can kind of see how he might think like that. But I'm saying, no, man, it's a spectrum, you know, and I held my position really solid. Because I mean, there was just, I'm not going to change what I think unless somebody says something that is, well, did you think about this? What about this? And I thought, well, I haven't thought about that. But in any case, the point is it was probably as big an ascension as I've had doing any kind of processing. And I mean, I think LR8 said something about the living lightning. I mean, it was like I was just electrified. And I mean, but the thing is, I had something come up and I lost that state, within an hour, because there were some things that weren't happening like I wanted them to happen. And I was afraid to use the power. And what you were saying about, have you ever used the power for destructive purposes? And that hadn't clicked, but that's the P3 thing. I mean, that's, I thought it was a pretty good process. The person we were co-processing at the time, I didn't know if the person I was co-processing with, had the skills really necessary. I mean, I should have I kind of ran it myself. I said, give me a minute and let me look at this for a minute. But it's, I kind of gives me a little bit of a insight on your background, and your name seems familiar for some reason. I don't know. I know I've seen it before, but I don't. But it's nice to. I'm glad to hear you. Played around with that process a little bit.
Oh yeah, let me tell you a few things, because I'm blessed with the perspective of having my own intuitive spiritual viewpoint and taking the time to really really understand Alan's work, all the people who did the work that Hubbard put his name on,
Yeah.
and so forth. But what I was describing, my procedure for stabilizing gains, that grew out of something that Alan had a hand in creating, celebration of
wins.
Yeah, that's basically, I've taken work from him, other people, and I've said, how can I say that better? That step is unnecessary. There's a big gap here that should be addressed in this, that's not addressed at all. And
Right.
But work with that. He's created some wonderful frameworks, but because you mentioned Presence 3, what I want to tell you about is the lineage of presence processes and Presence 3 very quickly. First of all, when Alan came into Scientology, he came in with such great understanding. He came in just at the right time. And of course, so much of Scientology is Alan Walter's work. I could tell you chapter and verse exactly what came from Alan. But Alan pointed out in a very good essay he wrote called a Pandora's Box, which you should read online, Alan Walter, Pandora's Box. And he talks about all the brilliant minds that came to St. Hill to work with Hubbard, spiritual, religious backgrounds, all kinds of things. I know in great detail, which I'm not going to bother to go into right now, but one thing I will talk about is in the mid-50s, Hubbard's son, L. Ron Hubbard Jr., as Alan, to use Alan's word, imported into Scientology a meditation technique, which in Scientology became TRs. OT, TR0, TR0. You're familiar with that, I'm sure. In Scientology, they call that confronting drills. And that's the number one thing that put it in the wrong direction. It's not, confronting suggests confrontation. And so you got people in a contest staring contest with each other. I can be more present than you, I can hold this, I can sit here and not blink and so forth. Not that some people didn't do extremely well on it, where it was well coached, but the basic idea was presence. And I'll define it better than Alan seemed to understand. Very simply, presence is accepting without resisting and really having the energies that we project to be present, and not only of oneself, but of others and objects and the complete environment. When you're doing, see, Alan very correctly changed the name from TRs to presence, and his instructions were better. I took it one further step, and I have people just sit there, just experience the other person's presence without pulling yours back. that's it, you know, and rather than the whole Scientology thing of flunking people, you know, if I see, and I do this, you know, I'll do this over Skype or FaceTime, I'll see them both. If I see somebody, you know, fidgeting or whatever, I can tell when somebody's going into their mind. I usually very frequently know a person's thoughts in such a situation. And I'll just say, excuse me a minute, what's happening? I'll ask the person what's happening. I say, okay, acknowledge. I say, okay, now just return to experiencing and having the other person's presence without pulling yours back at all. Just simply be, okay? And again, that came from basically a form of Eastern meditation. And the idea was simply presence, you know, and presence isn't just maintaining your presence. It's not simply noticing what is present. It is having the energies that are presence of all that is in your presence, you know? Don't push anything back, don't pull anything away. Just, it's a beautiful thing when you can do that. Most of us have experienced that, even if we, in TRs to whatever degree we did. And it's just a wonderful, it's a moment when instead of being something, you are simply being. Okay, and we talk about presence. That's why presence 3 is about processing identities, because what are identities but substitute presences? And that's why it fits into that lineup of presence, because they're substitute presences. And that's why some of the things that were missing from presence 3 that I put in had to do with processing the material that makes you feel like it's not safe to be present. And also what I added was the fact that when you, identities don't exist in a vacuum. They exist to respond or relate or deal with in some way to a particular corresponding identity. So I do a thing where I run through all the steps as I rewrote them and added and so forth. And there's a step in this, which is very important, where I ask, what response is your identity, whatever the particular identity is, seeking to get from others? What is the response you're seeking to get from others? And get the answer to that, and then say, okay, and who or what type of person is this identity seeking to get that response from? And then I go on to things like, what have the consequences been of seeking that response? Because we want the person to reevaluate and correct the conclusion through which they decided to adopt that identity. But then later on, when we're complete with all the steps of processing that identity, it's never complete to process one identity. That's the part that's not understood by most approaches to identities. Then we take up that corresponding identity and process the person on their having been that corresponding identity. Because there's a rule that I personally intuited and discovered about games. And when you have corresponding identities, they exist in some sort of game, some sort of effect on the other one. There's a winning and a losing and so forth. And the rule of any game that a being or identity has participated in is, if you've participated in whatever games you've participated in, you have occupied every role within that game. Only through the illusion and separation of time do we see ourselves as being in just one identity within that game. So therefore, you need to process the corresponding identity, because you couldn't be in that game unless you were all the identities. So it always comes up, okay, now we're gonna take a look at your identity of that other corresponding identity. And like, it's interesting because every time, whenever we do this, the other person immediately connects with having been the other identity. You know, it's like, it's obvious to them at that moment, you know? And when we do that and take through all the steps of that, then I just want one process, actually the harmony restoration process on the game itself. Within that game, I have, of course, they tell me what the game is. How would you articulate what that game is? And then say, okay, in the game of whatever, has there been something that you haven't been willing to experience? What problem we're trying to solve by not being willing to experience that? Has there been something that someone hasn't been willing to experience? Because it's someone within that game. And then in that game of whatever it is, has someone caused something that was not easy to experience. And at the end of that, there was a profound ascension every single time. When that whole game is blown, it is a huge and profound change, a big ascension that occurs, because at that point, they're completely liberated from a game they've been so invested in for an incredible continuum of time. It's a very big change.
I have a question. So when you're doing that process with people and they tell you what their game is, I can imagine that if you're entrenched in the game and you've been playing a specific role for some time, that you may not necessarily truly understand the motives, all the component parts. Do you yourself ever like try to say like, okay, I've seen this game before and it usually involves these parts we need to, do you sort of have a catalog? And the reason why I brought it up is it brought to mind a book that I read called Games People Play. And it's an older,
Eric Byrne.
yeah, Eric Burns. And it seems to me like a thesaurus of like all the aberrated games that, you know, I myself have been a part of. But I was just curious, like, how would that work? You
I'm sorry.
is there any, you know, and let it like it being a template, or is that never something that you felt is
Well,
necessary?
that's a good question. I'm going to go a little bit broader with what you're asking.
Oh.
This is the difference between the way I work and the way Alan worked. See, well, so first, to directly answer your question, I try not to ever interject. Sometimes I will, you know, but for the most part, it's always better if the person can find those aspects of what they're dealing with themselves. See, like in Alan's work, and from what you're describing, I've Eric Byrne's book, which I never actually read, but I think it came out like 1968 or something like that, because I remember when it was new. But see, it sounds like that book, like Alan's work, what's considered to be the highest level and the deepest level of Alan Walter's work, which was called Knowledgeism, is what's called the games matrix processing. And I know that in this games matrix processing, he lists out archetypes of identities and corresponding identities, you know, the warrior, whatever, you know, and some other people who, you know, I know of, and I know personally, who are quite brilliant, do the same thing in their own ways. You know, there's this and there's that. They define the personalities or identities, like Eric Byrne is defining the games and the strategies and whatever. I think that's very useful information, but for direct processing in a session, I'd rather ask the questions. Like in the Presence 3, I will ask what purpose or goal is associated with that persona. You know, I won't say, we'll give them a list of what are supposed to be the 12 basic goals and tell them to pick one. You know, it should come, and that's why it's important for the person to give a name to the persona that articulates it best for them. I don't want them to pick from the list. The list may be, I would say those lists, like somebody like Alan Walter, Eric Byrne, I'm not going to challenge that those lists may be essentially full and correct, except for the fact that each of us defines things in our own way. And I don't want to like have anybody try to shoehorn their exact frequency to correspond to, like, to submit to what I'm asking them to do. I want it to be 100% the way that, see, a more basic concept I put this way, like all the traps that we're in spiritually, everything, all of it. To me, I look at it this way: we create our own ways in, and we need to create our own ways out. So however you define, however you painted that painting, and you know somebody calls it blue and you call it teal, well then I got to have you call it teal. You know, I mean, because otherwise there could be problems where something's not quite processed, it's not quite on. Plus, I don't want to run in the direction of anybody feeling like they need answers from me, you know? That's one of the big problems for me with Scientology, with that E-meter and all of that was, you know, there were layers and layers of trust this more than what you think and trust that more. And there's an attitude in Scientology of don't let the PC run the session. Don't change with the PC. You know, you got to tell them what to do and ask the question until you get an answer. No, you know, you just, auditors need to shut up a lot more and talk. And I've trained about a dozen other practitioners and most of them had Scientology backgrounds. And there's a lot of untraining I need to do. Like, look, don't speak. I don't care if the person in front of you says they're done with the question. As long as they're not looking at you, because if they're looking away, they're still processing something. Trust me, they can say, I'm ready for the next question. And if they're looking over there, don't say a word. Don't say a word. And within probably 20 seconds, they're going to be telling you what's coming into their minds. Don't interrupt that flow. That's your spiritual compass. It's the most valuable guide you have is your own instincts. You never want to get in the way of that. And that's why I try to stay away from these brilliant, and I will call them brilliant archetypes, you know, from Eric Berne or L. Ron Hubbard or Alan Walter. They're very astute observations, but they can't be dead on because only you know what you feel is what's dead on. And so I think that's always going to be best. You know, it's like when you learn another language, usually when the second, third, fourth languages you learn, there's this step going on where you translate it in your mind into your home language. I don't want people to have to go through a translation step. I want to use their terms.
No, that makes perfect sense. And what I love about the response is that in a way, it's like very affirming of what is natural to me. I'm very intuitive, and Alka and I were having this conversation that I have a tendency to distrust that intuitive nature and want to layer on more formalized approaches that somehow this more structured approach is better and more refined than just because I'm intuiting it. And, you know, and like even what you were just mentioned about the TRs being a meditative process, like I cognited on this like a few months ago. I was like, this is just meditation, you know? And so to hear that is like, okay, I just need to continue to trust those intuitive urges or senses or knowings that I get. And, you know, when I do come across those materials, they do kind of give you like a vague, you know, framework, but don't try to define my experience necessarily in that term. But it can help me sometimes as a guidepost more so.
Exactly. It's like that's where it becomes a cult when their information supersedes your own perceptions. That's very dangerous. And like I will say, like all these people are brilliant. Everything we call cults, I would say almost all of them have something good to offer. But the problem is that you're supposed to then take everything they say as the word of God because something worked out. And that's where the danger is. You know, never submit. You know, as long as you can look at a body of information and say, that resonates with me, that definitely doesn't, that I don't know. As long as you can maintain your sovereignty. You know, it's like, again, like Alan Walter, brilliant man. I wish I could sit and talk with him, you know, but I have corrected and embellished. And so I've had many clients who have done knowledgeism. It seems like people graduate from Scientology to knowledgeism to me. But at the same time, it's like to dismiss any of them would be a terrible mistake, you know. But again, I can tell you where they missed information. I can tell you where their thinking wasn't exactly right. But God, there's so much to gain by exploring their information from that perspective. There really is. So it's interesting in Scientology. I'm definitely, I have to try not to be too critical of L. Ron Hubbard because I can see where he obviously twisted some very good things in order to keep the hamsters on the wheels, as I like to put it. You know, like, again, that whole layering of the meter knows more than you, the auditor knows more than you, the case supervisor knows more than the auditor, the senior case supervisor knows more than them, and L. Ron Hubbard knows more than everybody. You know, I refer to his, if you're familiar with in Scientology, familiar with Scientology? 10 points of keeping Scientology working. Well, first of all, he did that less than a year after he was humiliated and incredibly enraged because a major American magazine did an interview with him. I think it might have been Look magazine. I forget. I have it somewhere. I have the actual issue from 1964. And Hubbard expected to enthrall the reporter because he had a wonderful ability to enthrall people. I know people who met him in 1950 because I live where I am right now is 15 minutes from the original Elizabeth, New Jersey, Hubbard Dianetics Research Foundation. So back a few decades, I got to know a few people. So I worked in the printing industry who like sold printing papers to, I worked for somebody, a printer who actually did some printing for Hubbard back in those days. And one time he saw a Scientology book on my desk back in like 1980. He goes, oh, L. Ron Hubbard. Oh, I knew him. Wait a minute. I mean, that's like telling somebody you knew Elvis. You knew L. Ron Hubbard. Anyway, so I experienced people telling me, like one person in particular saying, you got all excited, oh, Ron Hubbard, man, it's the most amazing thing. You wanted to be where this guy was. Somebody introduced me to him and he gave me this great big bear hug, you know? I mean, like, you know, nobody's one-dimensional, you know, and he had this amazing quality about him, no doubt about it, you know? And anyway, he got incredibly enraged because he expected to do that number on the reporter, you know, and he kind of took that, you know, attitude of here, I'm handing you pearls of wisdom and fantastic truths, and he expected this flowery write-up, and the report was, well, it was sarcastic. It was like at one point he asked Hubbard, how many Scientologists are there? And Hubbard said, well, it's hard to say because every 6 months the number doubles. You know, he was prone to hyperbole. And so what the reporter put in the article was, based on these calculations, by August 1st, 1969, the last person on the planet will have given in and we will all be Scientologists. You know, it was like that. And like Hubbard was absolutely humiliated. And that was the thing he couldn't stand more than anything else. Was he himself walked around with tremendous fear of certain things. And the way it would come out is it would be expressed as great rage. And he would like basically cut people's heads off and dismiss them and so forth. And so in 1965, he wrote Keeping Scientology Working, the 10 points of keeping Scientology working, which are all 10 different ways of saying, thou shalt take no other God but me. And, you know, by that time, as you're reading this, there's a lot of fire and enforcement in there. It's like, damn it, if you don't want to be a destructive son of a bitch, you've got to do what I say, kind of a thing. And like, for instance, a story in there where somebody didn't audit somebody right or something. And so as a result, somebody got a beating from somebody who wasn't handled right, and they got cancer and died. And it was because of the beating that they got the cancer. And you read that and like, just a little tiny bit of you goes, huh? And then you just go over it and then you more or less accept it. Your cognitive dissonance, you kind of suppress. And that's how these things work. You're suppressing your cognitive dissonance to submit, you know? So it was statements like, we won't speculate here on how I came to rise above the bank, you know? So like, where did we agree he rose above the bank, you know? But he just simply asserted that in that sort of slip it in their way, you know? And what I am very certain of is that the reason that, if you look at it, it's contrived. How did he manage to stretch that out to be 10 points? You know, if you really look at it, think about it objectively, he was a writer, you know, he stretched it out, you know why? Because to create a subliminal connection with the 10 commandments.
That's deep.
Well, I tell you what, Dexter, this is amazing stuff because this is so close, but it expands on what some ideas I had. And there's a part where Alan, and we're talking about a dominator, as Alan puts it, or put it, and he said he was there watching it when that happened. This is with and I forgot what magazine it was too, but he thought it was going to be great. And then are you a weeper? And I mean, he was, this all, I don't have the exact timeline, but after that, he was definitely pissed, and the domination factor came in, and I mean, it's I'm really impressed. I mean, because I've yet to talk with anybody that has what I would consider to be the intimate details of, it's like I had a pretty good idea just putting stuff together, but not some of this stuff. So that's good.
Well, bear in mind that the way I see Hubbard is he had more than one drive in him. He had that fear drive, which made him have to like dominate and not accept any unacceptance of him. He also absolutely had to have a tremendous drive to find the answers in life for spirituality and share them. Without a doubt, he had a strong drive in that direction as well. Obviously, they were in conflict, and over time, definitely his insecurities took the wheel more and more. Every iteration of Dianetics since May 1950 was inferior to the previous one. Every iteration of Dianetics since then took more time and thereby money to complete the processing of one original item. And yet he had this magnificent way of promoting it to be, look how more detailed and complicated this is. This is going to reach so much further, And I remember training on New Era Dianetics in the late 70s, early 80s, and basically, you believed in the party line, and that you were doing was so far superior. Oh, they didn't have an E-meter in 1950, and all that kind of thing. But the original Dianist command from May, June 1950 is where this comes from. The file clerk will now give us the incident necessary to resolve the case. That was brilliant. And of course, there's no one incident that resolves a case. As a matter of fact, incidents don't really completely resolve cases because it's energies, not incidents. Incidents are merely manifestations of energies, but they're relevant as an entry point into at least part of those energies. I mean, we all know that Dianetics has its uses. It has its relative workability. It is far from absolute. And in the mid 60s, power processing was used. And power processing, he wrote a ton of confidential articles or bulletins to train auditors in power processing. And like over 90% of it was nonsense. Over 90% of it was these dramatic descriptions of how cataclysmic the incidents were that could come up. And it was the file clerk will now give us the incident necessary to resolve the case is essentially what it was. Power processing essentially was, there were 6 processes, which I've studied all this, I know it all inside and out. But the process labeled power process number 6, out of 6 processes, number 6, the conditions process, simply is the power process. 1 through 5 were developed later, one at a time, to enable people to run the conditions process as they came across more and more instances where it didn't run well for people. So it was but power process 6 is the original, the conditions process. In 1951, there was effort processing. Effort processing was a brilliant idea, and I'm bet my life it goes back to some form of Eastern technique. Is basically get the effort of whatever it is that is disturbing you, essentially, and get your counter effort to resist it. Essentially, is what it get the. It was simple. Get the effort, get the counter effort, and like in those days, the instructions Hubbard gave auditors, even through the 60s, were like, you'd walk around asking the other guys, "Did you get this? Do you understand from this what we're supposed to do?" he wasn't so articulate. He wasn't really all that great a communicator when his words weren't filtered and so forth a lot of times. But essentially it was get the effort, get the counter effort, okay? In other words, you're processing the energies that are opposing each other, which that's pretty much all there is to process. That's pretty much it. You know, it can take all kinds of configurations and come up with specific techniques for different configurations of that going on, you know, but that's essentially what there is. And what happened was he went into this and started developing these things because he lost the rights to the Dianetics book. He took on a partner. As always, he took advantage of the partner. The partner took him to court. Hubbard lost the rights to the Dianetics book. So, that was a very fortuitous thing because Hubbard was a great researcher. He was a magnificent researcher, and he went into other things, and wherever he got it from, that book, Scientology 88008 and 880. 880 is what today people would call energy healing and energy processing, because that's really what it's all about, energies, that's what it would be called in today's lingo, and there's like a million energy coaches, processes, etc. And so the basic idea is get the effort, get the counter effort. And it really means allow yourself to digest, open yourself up to experiencing, and let express through you the energies of whatever you're feeling. And as I've learned, get a person to express the energies that they've put into resisting whatever that disturbing thing is, because their resistance blocks it blocks the road. You have to open that door. You have to process your own resistive energy. So that's effort and counter effort. And power process 6, the conditions process, the actual commands basically were, tell me an existing condition. How have you handled that? Existing condition obviously is, in one way you could say it is the incident necessary to resolve the case. Another way you could say it is whatever is disturbing you, okay? And then how have you handled it? It's like, what's your counter effort? It's effort, counter effort is all that really is. It's 1951 effort processing. And yet, in all Hubbard's confidential training materials for power processing, he doesn't allow the trainees to know that. He doesn't explain that. But he explains it as this incredibly powerful technique that you have to be very careful with. You must get the wording exactly right. And you must do this and you must do that. And basically has them walking on eggshells when they run this process, And he created a great deal of mystery around it. The truth is, and you can see this in one of my videos on my YouTube channel, it basically made Dianetics obsolete. And that was the problem. So it can only be run after you run all your Dianetics, and it can only be run once. And these were very arbitrary rules for financial reasons. In reality, with that technique, Dianetics is basically obsolete. It's basically so much less efficient. And why would you go through this thing of having to find an incident, an earlier incident, an earlier incident? I could tell you a lot more about how power processing works. It doesn't work in a time sequential fashion. It kind of blows right through the whole idea that you have to keep going earlier, similar, which you don't. Again, my principle of honoring your spiritual compass, taking what your mind gives you, the person's own way that they've created things and experienced things, if you just let them take the way it's emerging for them, as opposed to find something earlier. It's very arbitrary to say when it should be. It really is. And again, you're forcing the PC to shoehorn their case into how it's supposed to work. And that's one of the problems of the limited liability, the limited workability and the liability of something like Dianetics. And that's why, by the way, my book, which is between my literary agent and various publishers at this point, the title of the book is Honoring Your Spiritual Compass. And basically, it's not just an approach for processing, it's how we should all be living. Trust your instincts. Trust your perception, trust your knowingness. You're never going to have anything better than that. All the all the programs you install, all the attitudes you say to always do this in that situation and so forth. I mean, ultimately, every bit of programming and every conclusion that you put there and say, from now on, this is the way to be, this is the way to react to this situation, this is what you do if that happens. Every single bit of pre-digested, pro forma, this is what to do, this is how to be, will always, and this is something that is just clarified for me in the past 2 years, this particular recognition, it will always eventually accomplish exactly what it's intended to prevent, and it will prevent exactly what it's intended to accomplish. Any pre-installed programming, anything that says, rather than be present, just affect this solution, will always do the opposite of what it's intended to do over time.
Mm. Mm.
So what about becoming OTs and spiritual bridge, crossing the bridge? So
Right. Well, that's also very arbitrary. I understand the theory and principle of it, but it's like in Scientology, you have to go through hundreds of hours of Dianetics and grades before you could run the power process, right? But I've run it on anybody and everybody as the very first thing back before I redevelop it as something much better. But even then, I would take strangers, somebody who never heard of Scientology, run this supposedly high level, only for people who are ready for it technique, and it works just the same, so like we're all walking around with whatever our interests are, and the fact that somebody has a particular spiritual ability or intuition or insight or whatever doesn't preclude them from all the same traps and all the same emotional issues as anybody else. What I'm really saying is people are such suckers for the idea of levels. Well, I'm up here, I'm OT2, yeah, but I'm OT6, so I'm 3 times you. It's nonsense. It's all nonsense. Nobody's better than anybody else, and nothing makes anybody better than anybody else, or more advanced, or, because that person that, you're observing because of the way they express themselves or the way they dress or whatever, as, they're way down there. If you listen, they could say something brilliant you never thought of before, and they could be, in their own ways, have a very, very connected spirituality. It's not like, all your perceptions and capabilities and knowledge like uniformly rise because that person who can, let's say, communicate with, your grandmother and tell you about a conversation you had with her before she died, might be the same person who gets out of his car and screams and curses at the driver in front of them for going too slow when they hit the red light. We all have, there's no objective scale. That's why we all have to just take what we get. I have this one spiritual technique I'm using more and more with people, and it really enhances spiritual perceptions and abilities. Less than a month ago, I'm just thinking of this one time with this one client. I said, we're going to do that. And I goes, great, we'll do this. And, he didn't know anything about my personal life. But a few minutes into this technique, everything changed for him. And he told me, your son who died loves you and he misses you. He didn't know I had a son who died until that moment. So you never know what somebody's capable of, and everybody's capable of everything, really. And to assign like what they call the Scientology OT levels, they were a lot better. Scientology OT levels, the Scientology bridge was originally created so that people could to bring people up to being able to run what's called creative processing. Creative processing, if you got the original earlier books, there's a lot of crediting to the different individuals who wrote the techniques, the processes in that book. Of course, long since then, everything became written by L. Ron Hubbard, you know, as history was rewritten. But there was like a technique early in creation of human ability, like a grand tour. Go out and explore the solar system. Go to this planet, go to that planet. There's just a few, what they call route one of creation of human ability, processes that invited you to do things that you would ordinarily not consider possible, but kind of stretch you out spiritually. And if somebody could not execute those instructions, then they went on to what's called route two in the book. The route one processes are labeled R1-1, R1-2. The route two processes are labeled R2-1, R2-2. The whole idea being to bring somebody up to where they could easily exercise these abilities. And most people couldn't, even with route two done. And those people that could, for the most part, could not maintain those abilities. And that was the purpose of the creation of these levels and steps that became the Scientology bridge or grade chart. The idea was to somehow bring people up to the level where they could execute fully and get the full benefits of this creative processing. Because that never was really succeeded. That's probably why Hubbard never really publicly mentioned that way. But that was the beginning of it, and it never happened. Hubbard observed that there could be a tremendous recoil after a while of running creative processing, where it was just like the person became so resistive or something. And the way he expressed that, in his words, were too much creative processing beefs up the bank. I mean, there is no bank, there is no container of, you know, there's not like there's an analyzer. There's just all these creations we've done to resist those things that we felt were too painful and we couldn't handle, overwhelmed us, and so forth. And that was, it was not an incorrect observation, but it was terribly vague. And then there was John Galusha, who worked with Hubbard, and he's the creator of what's called Identics, which some people love and have fantastic results from. Identics was based on processing out the personas or identities, or what Scientology called valences, that we take on. He very astutely observed that the main problem people were having with the creative processing is we're all walking around in various identities, you know, dominator, victim, grandmother, you know, infant, child, this, that, and like, you don't come across too many identities that include the ability to go fly out to Mars and Jupiter and Venus. That's not, you know, so when you're processing something like Grand Tour, they can't do it. Here's a rule about identities. I've learned so much that I've never seen written anywhere. An identity, when a person's in an identity, they can only acknowledge and experience whatever happens to be within the parameters of that identity. You say something that identity that isn't within its function, it's completely unreal. They have to reject it and dismiss it. Another thing about identities is that they take on a life of their own. Once you have an identity present, it's like they say God created man in his own image. We create identities with that same desperate drive to survive and exist. So identity resists being dismissed, and identity can resist being processed. Like there's this one particular process within the procedure that Alan Walter called Presence 3, which is actually a collection of processes that it specifically addresses, even though it doesn't say it anywhere. See, a lot of, when I look back at how Alan Walter or Ron Hubbard, whoever presented a process or technique, I see things that they never mentioned. I don't understand if they understood. Like Alan Walter never said Presence 3 is because identities are substitute presences, but he at least had to understand that if you had an identity, then you weren't present, and that's why he put it as Presence 3. You know, but Presence 3 is, what you're processing is substitute presences. Okay, so, excuse me. Anyway, with identities, they kind of fight back any effort to cause them to cease to exist. And Alan Walter, one of the techniques within Presence 3, directly deals with that identity's effort to persist and resist being processed. But what happens is, what John Galusha realized was the identities were the primary reason why nobody could connect with these abilities, because the identity that they were being, identities are not spiritual beings, identities are just attitudes essentially. And they don't have that within their parameters.
Yeah, I have a question. So Dexter, you mentioned you have written a book, Honoring Your Spiritual Compass, How You Should Be Living, right? So this has big appeal to me because, for me, day-to-day living and, processing and looking at your thoughts and all this, it seems like a cyclic thing, right? It goes on and on. So this book, what did you write about? Because this seems to simplify, it says like, follow your spirit and know how you should live. Like in the beginning, you said it should be fun, right? So do you want to tell a little bit more? I'm curious about this book.
Well, the book is a collection of writing I've been doing between 2010 and 2019. I would jot a few notes, I would write something down, knowing, with the intention to one day put it in a book. It covers a lot of subject. It covers my analysis of behind what the dynamics of what make a technique work, what made techniques not work, what made them work, like the observations I made of spirits, of us, of people, of beings, our desires, what gets in the way of them, our tendencies. It covers so much material. I try to be basic, all the way from basic to specific. The book includes many techniques that I've written that I rewrote for a person to do on their own, which is not going to be as effective as getting professional sessions, something like 95% of the time, but is still well worth doing, and maybe it'll inspire somebody to go get the next step, I'll give you like many observations I made. Like I have inspirations every single day. I take a walk through an undisturbed natural area because it's been very clear to me since I was young that all life is aware. All life has awareness. Plants, trees, they have awareness. I could feel the awareness walking through a place like that. It's still individualities, but more of a recognized collective consciousness than we commonly connect with, and so that brings about certain awarenesses, but I put myself in that place, and a lot of thoughts crystallize, and I get inspirations, and I realize something that for me is profound, and then I would write about it and I would add it to the book. Like one example is maybe the biggest barrier we have to having what we want and being how we want to be is not giving ourselves permission, not being afraid to expose ourselves that much, being afraid we'll do harm, being afraid we'll come into conflict with others, being afraid that there's this terribly wrong idea that being great makes you better than somebody else, the idea that it's egotistical to think of yourself as being great and beautiful and amazing. That's, anybody who would say that's egotistical, like one observation Alan Walter made, which was right on, of many, was that he wrote something called The Dance of the Dots, or The Deadly Dance of the Dots. Alan actually never got over what Hubbard did to him in reality, because he never stopped talking about it. And he described people in absolutes, there's some just very, very evil people and so forth. And he really promoted and communicated very much like Hubbard. Alan never realized how much he was still trapped within that game with Hubbard. But to my observation, Alan outplayed him. But he, that was one thing that if I had worked with Alan, I could have easily helped him over that, I believe. But anyway, in the deadly dance of the dots, it speaks sort of in absolutes, but it correctly conveys the idea that people who are in unhappy, dysfunctional, lesser states of existence, or feel that they are, try to bring others down to their level so they can feel like they can be on a parity with everybody else. And maybe thinking about that now, I'm just having the inspiration that maybe the more basic issue is this idea that there's such a thing as being better or worse than anybody else. That would make somebody feel like they have to, like they're on a lower level, so they have to bring everybody down to their level. Of course, there's no such thing as levels, but when we function within a competitive sort of a world, then that's a problem, So, so the idea there is that, that's what's happening. People are doing that, it's out of a need to not feel inferior.
Can I share something that I've been thinking on in regards to that specifically? So I think about, and I don't know another word for it except for karma, the cycles of that people get locked into. And what, like from my experience with that, like, you have colloquial phrases like misery loves company and things like that. But sometimes I wonder, or what it starts to look like to me is that there's someone who's trapped in some sort of karmic cycle, and they observe someone who maybe is not so trapped in a karmic cycle, and they want someone to share in that with them for whatever reason. Maybe it is to be on the same level, or maybe it's just that you don't look as burdened as me. Help me carry some of this load. In some, I don't know. So that's just something that because I've been looking at that in those experiences with people, and not as a, just to understand like what happens. And because, like, as I listen to you and I think about my life, I'm like, okay, if I throw out everything, the choice that I made from a certain point forward, I'm probably okay. I could just be the way, that I came into this world, and I'm perfectly fine. Like all of the stuff that I'm processing is stuff that I've been adding on. So, and I don't know, and I don't know why, just intuitively, even as a younger person, I was just aware of things that people were doing. And I'm like, that's not really a good idea. And, and I just always had this desire to keep my load a little bit lighter. But I always felt people trying to pull me into theirs. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're coming to the point where at least you can say I'm probably okay. That makes me laugh. I might possibly be okay. Right?
Forget everything for it. I think
it goes back to the point I was beginning to make just a few minutes ago of granting ourselves permission. It's okay for you to say, I'm damned great. I'm beautiful. Wow. This is wonderful. It doesn't make anybody else less. That's I think the problem is the idea that it makes somebody else, not to make somebody else, you're not egotistical because you think you're beautiful unless you think everybody else isn't, That's that competitive thing that goes on, which is so wrong. I learned physically. I mean, I worked out with weights a long time, like probably most of my life. And I learned my lesson going into the gym and looking at how much weight guys with frames that were bigger than mine were benching, So I benched way too much weight, and that's how I tore my rotator cuff. It's like, okay, lesson learned. You're not in competition with other people. You only want to compare how you are now to how you were then. That's all. This cracks me up. I probably might be okay. I'm glad you're arriving at that, going in that direction.
because it's like I look at all of the things that I'm like chasing down, and I'm like, but those are things that I added later. And if I just let all that go, I never needed to. I mean, I was happy. I was always pretty just happy and content, but a lot of it was, trying to fit in, trying to conform to what, that competition. Like I I kind of always felt like I never was competing with anybody but myself. But then you get into a certain phase of life and you're like, oh, am I supposed to be competing with other people? And, and you go into those sorts of things.
I play a lot of basketball. It's one thing that's killing me with this COVID thing is I can't get together with my basketball guys a couple times a week. I literally had both of my Achilles tendons had to be surgically repaired. I tore one right off the bone in a basketball game. But all that basketball playing was very highly competitive, always was. But it was never like got to be better than the other guy. I mean, like to me, we were all just having fun together. Like you play to win and you play really hard to win. But like if somebody else made a good shot against me or defended me well, I was like, that was really cool what you did there, man. That was great. It's like, I feel like, I can't let them think they're as good as me or better than me. None of that. At least the way I approach games, it's not trying to make less of somebody else. I'm not threatened by the fact that somebody can pull a good move on me. That's just very cool. It's just cool. It's great. That's all. That's the way games have to be.
Yeah. So the identity is not tied up in the outcome.
Right. My self-esteem is not at stake in a game of basketball. Nor should anyone else's be.
So, everybody is infected with this virus, like you can do it better. Whatever you do, you can do it better. Go for it. So maybe the add-on is you can do it better than others is what is, not good. You can do it better is always good. I think so.
Yeah, I think that it's just about the moment. Like I can think of many moments when I pulled off a great shot, playing with guys 30 years younger than me and ran through them or whatever. And it's a great moment. It's just a great moment. It doesn't establish anything other than it was a great moment. That's the way I like it. I can still do this and have fun. It doesn't establish that I'm better than them or they're better than me. Just enjoy, as and I think part of love being the basis of all things, and that is an absolute truth. I just wrote this in the past week, but people only understand half about empathy. Empathy as feeling another person's pain and so forth, but it's also taking great pleasure in somebody else's pleasure. I mean, if that's what's missing, that concept that's got to be fully recognized. How can you have a relationship? How does that work if the other person doesn't take pleasure in your pleasure? It's a conflict if you don't have that. You can't take pleasure in the other person. Oh, but I don't want you to go out, but it gives me so much pleasure. I feel good. Go do that. I mean, that's love is greatly taking pleasure in the other person's pleasure. And that part of empathy, that, for lack of a better way of putting it, the positive or higher scale part of it, seems to be so not understood or recognized. And basically there's love and there's fear, and most basic fear is not being loved, not being accepted, being rejected, not being included. I mean, ultimately love is a recognition and happy acceptance that there is no there. We're all here. All there is here. And we create all these barriers in our minds, to keep people at a distance, to separate continuums of our own lives from other parts of our lives, to have this disconnect mechanism. And these are all artificial creations. When you do that presence process, not presence 3, but presence, or OTTR0, or in its original form, as a meditation technique, or as people speak about it now as mindfulness and presence and being in the moment. It's just having and taking great pleasure in here we are. I love us. That's it. That's where it all springs from. That and the feeling of being excluded from that, being the fear. I could break anything down to that.
Love is the key to everything.
Love is existence, and existence is love. You're less present and therefore less existing to the point where you're so in fear of not having love that you put something else there because you feel in some way you're not acceptable and won't be loved. So you have to be this or you have to be that. You know, sometimes we run identities in sessions once or twice. Sometimes I have a client say something like, well, who should I be now? What should I be now? You know, it's like the whole idea, as I would put it, don't be something, just be. You know, I kind of wonder if there is such a thing as a personality, or whether it's all just a collection of how to present yourself. You know, because ultimately, what would there be but tremendous love, acceptance, happiness, joy, fun? You know, I mean, that's what we all obviously need, want, and thrive on. You know, it's so obvious, and yet, like just the other day, I wrote this down. If you not feel, if you're feeling unloved, then you need to take a look at what you've created in order to feel that way. There was you know, it's so funny that we should even have to enlighten people that it's all about love and fun and joy. It reminds me of like this little sequence in this comedy film from like 30 years ago about a little big league, about a little boy who inherits a baseball team when his grandfather dies and makes himself the manager of the team. He's like 12 years old. At one point he goes to the players, look guys, forget everything I said before, I messed up. I just want you to go out there and have fun. And this one pitcher with an attitude goes, I hate fun. It's such an absurd statement. You can't hate fun, you know? You can't hate love, you know? I mean, you know, sometimes we create such complexities that we can't even recognize why we started creating those things.
Thank you, Dexter. I think we have taken lots of your time and we went through marathon of thoughts. That's what I feel.
I would.
Now it will take time to settle down.
Yeah.
Okay. Hope to see you soon again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great connecting with all of you. You're more than invited to stay in touch with me, and really great to connect with all of you. Thank you.
Same here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you too.
How can I mean, just get with Alka on how to stay in touch with you, Dexter, or what? I mean, what's your suggestion on that?
I'm on Facebook. If you look me up, Google my name, I have a website, dexsessions.com.
Okay.
Basically just, Google made a point about 7 or 8 years ago of notifying me that I'm the only Dexter Gelfand in the United States. It wasn't a surprise. So I'm not hard to find.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, I know I've seen your name before, and of course I have, you know, a few people and some old timers that I've, you know, ran across at the ranch. I mean, you know, it was a great experience, but you know, it's glad to, or I'm really, this has been a very fun Zoom here.
Yes, it has been fun. It's been fun for me too. I've had many clients who've been to the ranch. My marketing guy, who I trained in my techniques, he's been to the ranch. I think like maybe like a quarter of my clients have been to the ranch. And what they don't know is I probably studied Alan in more depth than they have.
I had no idea until you mentioned that, but that's, I mean, and I'm not trying to drag this on, but you know, you're talking about the conflicts he had with LRH. Well, you probably read about the thing when they moved to Wales and he got thrown down the well and all that. I mean, that I don't think he ever ran that out either, but you know, he was a hell of a lot of fun. I mean, and he's good. I mean, we had a good time up there.
I think if I had a list of, say, a half dozen people I would like to have known, he would definitely be on that list.
Okay then. See you again.
By the way, on my website, there's a contact page that you can also just directly contact me through, but I'm very accessible.
Great, good to know.
Alka can tell you. Alka can tell you.
Oh, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good. You know, it's good to have a bunch of people with a similar intention, I think, you know, that, and, you know, little, maybe slightly different viewpoints, but, you know, this person sees this person sees that, and you look at, wow, you know, this definitely expands my viewpoint or gives me another viewpoint, you know, but
Yeah, we all share a passion.
yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Bye bye.